Hello, I'm Alma Angeles, and you're watching Eagle News International. Hello, CJ.
Hello, Alma, and good evening to everyone watching our program. Here are tonight's headlines.
Myanmar's ousted civilian leader Aung San Suu Kyi appears in good health despite 2 months of detention, according to her legal team Wednesday, as diplomatic pressure on the military junta ramped up.
The Philippines on Tuesday voiced dismay at reports of excessive force by Myanmar's military against unarmed protesters on Armed Forces Day, which killed over 100 people but will not intervene in the ongoing unrest.
And police in New York arrested early Wednesday a suspect in a brutal videotaped assault of a 65-year-old Asian-American woman believed to be of Filipino descent, the latest incident of anti-Asian violence in the United States.
And Washington residents flocked to the tidal basin to enjoy the city's famous cherry blossom trees in peak bloom.
First, to the ongoing crisis in Myanmar, the ousted civilian leader Aung San Suu Kyi appears to be in good health despite 2 months of detention. That is according to her legal team on Wednesday, as diplomatic pressure on the military junta ramped up. The 75-year-old Suu Kyi has not been seen in public since she was deposed by the military and detained in the early hours of February 1. Take a look.
I just know why people say...
By the appearance on the screen of the video, Aung San Suu Kyi seems to be in good health. She demanded and she asked for private meeting as lawyer and defendants with our defense counsels.
Daily protests demanding the restoration of the elected government have been met with a crackdown that has left more than 520 civilians dead in the week since the February 1 coup. The junta's violent response has triggered international condemnation and threats of retaliation from some of Myanmar's myriad ethnic armed groups. A member of Suu Kyi's legal team, Min Min So, was summoned to a police station in the capital Naypyidaw for a video meeting with her on Wednesday, and Suu Kyi is facing a raft of criminal charges, and conviction could see her barred for life from political office. Suu Kyi noted that during the meeting, police officers remained at the lawyer's side and guards monitored her at her end, according to the statement, adding that the Nobel laureate had asked whether this was lawful.
The Philippines on Tuesday voiced dismay at reports of excessive force by the Myanmar military against unarmed protesters on Armed Forces Day, which killed over 100 people, but will not intervene in the ongoing unrest. Manila issued the statement through the Department of Foreign Affairs amid the reports that 107 people, including children, were killed by security forces across Myanmar on Saturday during a crackdown. The Philippine government reiterated its call for security forces in Myanmar to exercise restraint and desist from resorting to disproportionate force against unarmed citizens. Over 100 people, including some children, were reportedly killed in a lethal crackdown on pro-democracy protesters during Myanmar's Armed Forces Day, the worst day of violence since the military junta seized power. According to news agency Myanmar Now, 11 children were among the casualties, and that those under 16 years old were not even anti-regime protesters, but rather were shot indiscriminately in and around their homes. As of March 29, the news agency said about 400 have been killed by the junta's armed forces since February 1, at least 26 of whom are children under 18 years old.
And the U.S. State Department has ordered the departure of non-essential diplomats from Myanmar, it said in a statement, amid a crackdown on protesters that has killed hundreds since the country's military coup began. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken condemned the abuses in Myanmar. Take a look.
Nonviolent protesters in Burma have been killed, beaten, imprisoned, including on Saturday, when more than 100 people were reportedly killed by the military. Many of those killed were protesting on Armed Forces Day, others simply bystanders. The military said in advance that they might shoot protesters in the back or the head, and they'd made good on that threat. Among those reportedly killed, 4 children, the youngest, a 5-year-old boy. We condemn these and other widespread violations by Burma's security forces in the strongest terms. And we continue to call on the military regime to release all those people who've been unjustly detained, stop its attacks on civil society members, journalists, labor unionists, halt the killings by its security forces, and return to power the democratically elected government.
In mid-February, the State Department authorized a voluntary departure of non-emergency U.S. government employees and their family members, according to the statement, adding that the department had updated that status to ordered departure. A spokesperson said the Department of State made the decision to authorize ordered departure from Burma because the safety and security of U.S. government personnel and their dependents, as well as private U.S. citizens, is the department's highest authority or priority. The civilian death toll from the military's crackdown has now passed 520, with world powers ramping up their condemnation of the military's campaign in the wake of the February 1 coup. And the ordered departure status will be reviewed in 30-day increments. The U.S., Britain, and EU have already imposed sanctions in response to the coup and crackdown, but so far, diplomatic pressure has not persuaded the generals to ease off.
In a related news, Japan has halted new aid to Myanmar in response to the coup, according to the country's foreign minister, but is stopping short of sanctions imposed by some nations on military and police commanders. Japan is a top aid donor to Myanmar, and Foreign Minister Toshimitsu Motegi said the suspension of assistance would send a clear message. The United States, Britain, and the European Union have announced a range of sanctions targeting top police and military commanders linked to the coup, as well as military-owned companies. But Japan, which has strong economic ties with Myanmar and long-standing relations with its military, has opted to take more directly punitive measures. Japan has criticized the coup in Myanmar and called for the restoration of democracy, but it has faced calls to stake out a stronger position on the crisis. Tokyo has traditionally maintained cordial ties with Myanmar while also supporting the cause of civilian leader Aung San Suu Kyi, who briefly lived in Kyoto as a young researcher. Thousands of Japanese nationals and several hundred Japanese companies are believed to be in Myanmar, and Japan is reportedly the 5th largest foreign investor in the country.
Meanwhile, a German company that supplies products to make Myanmar banknotes has suspended deliveries in response to growing violence following the military coup to oust civilian leader Aung San Suu Kyi. Now, Gisechi and Devrient said in a statement that this is a reaction to the ongoing violent clashes between the military and the civilian population. The company had already restricted its supply of raw materials, supplies, and system components for the production of banknotes in recent weeks. The U.S., Britain, and the European Union have announced a range of sanctions targeting the top police and military commanders linked to the coup, as well as military-owned companies.
Meanwhile, Secretary of State Antony Blinken vowed Tuesday the United States will speak out about human rights everywhere, including in allies and at home, turning a page from Donald Trump as he bemoaned deteriorations around the world. Presenting the State Department's first human rights report under President Joe Biden, the new top U.S. diplomat took some of his most pointed yet still veiled swipes at the approach of the Trump administration. Watch this.
One of the core principles of human rights is that they are universal. All people are entitled to these rights, no matter where they're born, what they believe, whom they love, or any other characteristic. Some have argued that it's not worth it for the United States to speak up forcefully for human rights, or that we should highlight abuse only in select countries and only in a way that directly advances our national interests. I believe those people miss the point. Standing up for human rights everywhere is in America's interests. And the Biden-Harris administration will stand against human rights abuses wherever they occur, regardless of whether the perpetrators are adversaries or partners.
Meanwhile, police in New York arrested early Wednesday a suspect in a brutal videotaped assault of a 65-year-old Asian-American woman, the latest incident of anti-Asian violence in the U.S. Police announced the arrest on Twitter and said the man was charged with felony assault as a hate crime. The tweet didn't give his name, but U.S. news outlets identified the man as Brandon Elliott, 38 years old. The attack, which took place on a sidewalk in broad daylight in Midtown Manhattan on Monday, was caught on CCTV footage from inside an adjacent building. In the video posted online by police, the man can be seen walking up to the woman and kicking her in the stomach, knocking her down to the ground. He then kicks her several times in the head before walking away. Now, the video also shows a man who appears to be a delivery worker watching the attack unfold from inside the building. He is then joined by two other men, one of whom closes the door rather than coming to the woman's aid as the assailant walks away. Now, police had asked the public for help in identifying the attacker. Residents identified him as a local homeless person and directed police to a hotel serving as a shelter for people without homes, and he was arrested there, according to New York news outlets. The victim, whose identity has not been released but is said to be of Filipino descent, was hospitalized with multiple injuries, including a broken pelvis. She was in a stable condition Tuesday, according to police. In a statement, the NYPD said the attacker made anti-Asian statements towards the victim as he kicked her. It added that the force's hate crime task is investigating the assault. And the news continues here on Eagle News. We'll be right back.
This portion is brought to you by Canriv Corporation, your ventilation and air conditioning specialist. Services offered: supply and installation of elevators, escalators, air conditioners, ventilators, jet towel, hand dryers, generators, access control system, factory automation, and modernization. For more info, please contact Ami Kanke at 0915-263-7198 or 0998-900-3224.
Mula noon hanggang ngayon, gabay natin ang MTRCB ratings sa matalino at responsableng panonood. Sa tamang pagsunod sa MTRCB ratings, ginagawa nating ligtas at makabuluhan ang panonood ng bawat miyembro ng pamilyang Pilipino. Lumipas man ang panahon, hanggang may pamilyang Pilipino, andyan ang MTRCB.
Welcome back to the news. Donald Williams, the first witness to take the stand on the second day of the trial of Derek Chauvin, becomes emotional while listening to the 911 call he placed on the day of George Floyd's death. Williams testified that he, quote, felt the need to call the police on the police because he believes he witnessed a murder. Watch this.
They just stay here and wash it in front of us as well.
Okay.
And she told them to check the man's pulse, but they wouldn't even check the pulse.
Okay, 1 second.
I have reached the city of Minneapolis to reach someone in our property.
Y'all niggas is murderers, bro. Minneapolis Third Precinct.
Hey, it's dispatch.
Yeah, man. So I want to speak to a supervisor.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, he wants to speak with the supervisor relating to 320's called Cup Food.
And so you felt a need to call the police?
Yeah, I felt the need to call the police on the police.
Now, there were police there, right?
There were police there.
Okay, why didn't you just talk to them about it?
I believe that they didn't. We just didn't have no connection. You know, I spoke to them, but not on a connection of a human being relationship.
Do you, believe that they were involved?
Yes, totally.
And so, when you made that 911 call, about how long after the ambulance left was that?
Time recollection? I don't know.
Was it a matter of minutes?
Minutes, seconds. Not too long after they retreated to the other side of the street, I proceeded to call the police.
The evidence will show that Mr. Floyd died of a cardiac arrhythmia that occurred as a result of hypertension, his coronary disease, the ingestion of methamphetamine and fentanyl, and the adrenaline flowing through his body, all of which acted to further compromise an already compromised heart.
This case is about Mr. Derek Chauvin and not about any of those men and women, and it's not about all policing at all. And this case is not about split-second decision-making. In 9 minutes and 29 seconds, there are 479 seconds, not a split second a month. That's what this case is about.
You will learn that we are approaching 50,000 bait-stamped items. So this case is clearly more than about 9 minutes and 29 seconds. As you all saw during jury selection, the witness list in this case neared 400 people. So how do we begin to analyze and organize this evidence? I suggest that you let common sense and reason guide you. When you see these videos pulled back from afar, you will be able to see the Minneapolis police squad car rocking back and forth during this struggle. So much so that it catches the attention of the 911 dispatcher, Jenna Scurry. This was not an easy struggle.
Floyd was originally arrested on May 25, 2020 for passing a counterfeit $20 bill, but the situation worsened after officers struggled to put him in a police car and instead forced him to the ground handcuffed. In the video, Floyd moans and gasps for air while bystanders urged Chauvin to let up. Chauvin, a 19-year veteran of the police force, is charged with murder and manslaughter and faces up to 40 years in prison if convicted of the most serious charge, second-degree murder. But his attorney, Eric Nelson, told the jury of 9 women and 5 men that Chauvin adhered to policing standards.
Stop. This in Exhibit 7.
Former U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, a strident critic on China on Tuesday, alleged that an international report into COVID's origins was a cover-up backed by Beijing. The long-awaited report by experts appointed by the World Health Organization and their Chinese counterparts said that the global pandemic likely came to humans from animals and that it was extremely unlikely the virus escaped from a lab in the city of Wuhan. Let's listen in.
I think there was, that's accepted by everybody. There was a lot of attention, a lot of pressure on all this work. We also had the entire world following every move we made during our stay in Wuhan, whether during quarantine or after the quarantine, the first quarantine period. And of course, there was a lot of interest from all sides. And I think, as you said, of course, there was political pressure from all sides, also outside China. But I think we were able to create a space for the science, a space for the two groups of scientists that were together. It is perfectly possible that you would have earlier cases, sporadic cases circulating in and around Wuhan before December, let's say November and potentially also October 2019, and potentially that some of them were also traveling abroad and seeding and transmitting the disease abroad, again in sporadic way elsewhere during November and earlier December. But because of the strong suspicion of certain bat species being the host of this virus and having found other relatively close virus strains to SARS-CoV-2 in the region, also in Southeast Asia in general, where these bats are living, is a strong indication that that's where the source is. But we're still working on finding the exact traceback of the virus before Wuhan. Lab accidents, of course, do happen once in a while. We've seen that throughout history in many places. So, of course, it's possible, and therefore it's also part of the conclusions in the report that it's not impossible that could have happened. But we haven't seen or been able to hear or see or look at anything that would warrant different conclusions from our side.
The WHO report is a sham continuation of the CCP-WHO disinformation campaign. Mike Pompeo wrote on Twitter, referring to the Chinese Communist Party, "It's why I recommended we leave WHO." Alluding to the UN body's early downplaying of the virus, Pompeo charged that WHO chief Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus collaborated with Chinese President Xi Jinping to hide human-to-human transmission at a critical juncture. Pompeo said the Wuhan Institute of Virology remains the most likely source of the virus, and WHO is complicit. Pompeo, who is widely seen as aspiring to run for president, took the lead under former President Donald Trump in blaming China for the pandemic that has claimed some 550,000 lives in the U.S. In his final days in office, Pompeo released what he said were U.S. findings that workers at the laboratory had fallen ill in 2019 with symptoms that were reminiscent of COVID or other illnesses.
In a related news, China on Wednesday slammed unethical critics as it faced mounting pressure over the origins of COVID-19 after the World Health Organization chief revived the theory that the coronavirus may have leaked from a Chinese lab. WHO chief Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus urged a deeper investigation into whether the COVID outbreak originated with a leak from the lab. The United States also led a chorus of concern over the findings, with China riled by swirling accusations that it failed to give proper access and data to the investigators. Watch this.
但是呢，我们知道国际上疑虑始终存在，我们也知道的，早期也有在世界多点爆发的这样的一个很多的报道。我们也知道，有些国家，比如说除了德特里特堡，还有全球200多个生物基地。所以我想呢，应该让科学家本着科学的精神和态度，对相关如果有需要的话，我说如果有需要的话呢，对其他的世界各地的相关的实验室呢开展工作。我们希望美国纠集极少数的国家发表所谓的联合声明，公然的质疑和否定中国世卫组织联合专家组的报告，这是他们不尊重科学、借溯源搞政治操弄的确凿的证据。美国呢，其实。
China was not mentioned directly by the WHO chief, or in the statement, even by the United States and its 13 allies, but Beijing hit back, saying it had demonstrated its openness, transparency, and responsible attitude. Tedros said the WHO team expressed the difficulties they encountered in accessing raw data. China was slammed last year by former U.S. President Donald Trump, who had promoted the theory that the virus could have leaked from the Wuhan Institute of Virology and accused Beijing of not being transparent about the initial outbreak. Beijing has rejected those allegations.
In other news, 5 Thai activists were indicted today on charges of attempted violence against the Queen. Now, this was during a pro-democracy rally last year when a royal motorcade encountered dozens of protesters. Joining us live from Bangkok, here's Gila Pablo. Hello, Gila. Okay, Gila, I can't hear you. I think you have to unmute your audio.
Yeah, sorry for that.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah, Alma,
Good to hear
so
that.
you're right. 5 pro-democracy activists in Thailand were charged Wednesday with the criminal offense of attempting to harm the Queen over an encounter with royal motorcade during a protest last year. If convicted, the group could face a minimum of 16 years jail or life in prison under a law that has not been used for decades and punishes any act of violence against the Queen or her liberty. And if the court finds they put the Queen's life in danger, they could be sentenced to death. They were charged over an incident during a protest in October last year when thousands marched from the Democracy Monument to the Government House in Bangkok. A motorcade ferrying Queen Sutida and Prince Dipankon Rasmijudi passed through the protest zone, and some protesters crowded around the vehicle, raising the 3-fingered salute of defiance adopted from the Hunger Games books and films. Such an overt challenge of the monarchy is unprecedented in Thailand, where a draconian defamation law has been used to shield the royal family from criticism. The court granted 5 protesters bail after they were formally charged on Wednesday, Thai lawyers from Human Rights told AFP. They had to post between 200,000 baht to 300,000 baht, equivalent to $6,400 to $9,600. One of the accused, Bung Kuanun Francis Pautong, 21, said he had no intention of harming the Queen. He told reporters it had been a wretched and excruciating 5 months in legal limbo. The pro-democracy protest in Bangkok kicked off last July and called for the resignation of Prime Minister Prayut Chan-o-cha's government and a rewrite of the military's scripted constitution. Back to you, Alma.
All right, thank you very much, Gila, and looking forward to more updates as we follow this developing story. Thank you, Gila. Thank you for your time.
Yes, Alma, thank you, and stay safe. Again, this is Gila Pablo reporting live from Bangkok, Thailand. We live in interesting times.
Back to COVID-19 news now. Germany will deploy AstraZeneca's coronavirus vaccine for general use only for over 60-year-olds, the government said on Tuesday, imposing restrictions for younger people taking the jab after several severe clotting cases. Chancellor Angela Merkel noted that experts have recorded in recent weeks very rare but very serious cases of thrombosis in people vaccinated with AstraZeneca. Watch this.
Empfehlungen der Ständigen Impfkommission beruhen auf Erkenntnissen, die Fachleute in den vergangenen Wochen über sehr seltene, gleichwohl sehr schwere Fälle von Thrombosen bei mit AstraZeneca geimpften Personen gesammelt haben. Es sind Erkenntnisse, die die Ständige Impfkommission und damit schließlich auch wir nicht ignorieren können. Deshalb haben Bund und Länder heute Abend entschieden, der Empfehlung der Ständigen Impfkommission zu folgen.
Under 60s can still decide to take the vaccine, but only following consultation with a doctor carrying out the vaccination and with an individual risk analysis, said ministers of Germany's 16 states, as well as the federal health minister in a policy statement. The World Health Organization and the EU's health watchdog have both deemed the AstraZeneca vaccine safe, but several countries have restricted its use over clotting fears. The cities of Berlin and Munich, as well as Brandenburg State, had announced earlier that they were suspending the vaccine for younger people. Germany's medicines regulator, the Paul-Ehrlich Institute, has now reported 31 cases of blood clots in people who have received AstraZeneca, Der Spiegel magazine reported on Tuesday. Almost all cases are reportedly in younger and middle-aged women, prompting several German hospitals to suspend the use of the jab for women under 55 this week. On Monday, Canada also recommended halting the use of the jab for under 55s, pending further analysis.
WHO vaccine experts said that an interim analysis of clinical trial data from 2 Chinese COVID-19 vaccines showed they demonstrated safety and good efficacy, but that more data was needed. The Chinese firms Sinovac and Sinopharm, whose COVID jabs are already being used in several countries, have submitted data and applications for the World Health Organization's Emergency Use Listing, or EUL green light. The UN Health Agency Strategic Advisory Group of Experts on Immunization, or SAGE, said it had reviewed the data provided so far and that both vaccines demonstrated safety and good efficacy against symptomatic COVID-19 disease. However, it warned both vaccines lack data in older age groups and in persons with comorbidities, meaning other medical conditions. The 2 vaccines are among 4 homegrown jabs that have been approved by Chinese regulators so far. But SAGE pointed out that neither had yet received authorization by what the WHO considers a stringent regulatory authority. SAGE, which advises the WHO on immunization policies, said it would hold off on issuing recommendations for how the 2 Chinese vaccines should be used until after another expert panel rules on their EUL applications.
In other news, the cockpit voice recorder from a crashed Indonesian jet has been retrieved in good condition, officials said Wednesday, more than 2 months after the airliner plunged into the sea, killing all 62 passengers and crew. The CVR records flight crew conversations and could offer critical clues about why the Sriwijaya Air Boeing 737-500 dived around 3,000 meters or about 10,000 feet into waters off Jakarta just minutes after takeoff on January 9. The jet's flight data recorder, which holds information about the speed, altitude, and direction of the plane, was earlier plucked from the wreckage-littered Java Sea. Authorities said Wednesday that the voice recorder unit was in good condition despite having been in the water for months. Investigators want to mine the recorder in the hopes of learning what the crew was saying when the flight from the capital to Pontianak in Borneo went down. A preliminary report last month into the crash said crews on previous flights had described the jet's throttle system as unserviceable and that it had been repaired several times before its fatal final flight. The report said a catastrophic throttle malfunction and possible human error were among the factors being considered, but investigators had said it was too early to pinpoint a cause. The 737 had sharply deviated from its intended course just before it plunged.
Pada siang hari ini, juga kepada semua.
Meanwhile, UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson said he sees nothing in the data that shows they can now ease lockdown measures. Here's Ariana Celestino for the report.
Hi, here is my update in the United Kingdom. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson vowed Saturday to stick with his planned unwinding of a coronavirus lockdown. Relishing the prospect of a pint and a haircut, even as scientists warned of new variants. Launching his Conservative Party's campaign for local elections in May, Johnson said his government's mass vaccination drive and pro-business policies would hasten economic recovery. Job by job, job by job. Wales became the first UK nation to lift travel restrictions on Saturday, since the latest round of curbs took hold to combat a deadly second wave of COVID-19 over winter. From Monday, England's stay-at-home order is relaxed to enable groups of up to 6 people to meet outside. The government plans to allow non-essential retail, such as hairdressers, from April 12. Johnson conceded that a third wave of COVID-19 was sweeping Europe and could well hit Britain in about 3 weeks. But the key difference to last year was that any rise in infections and hospitalizations should be sufficiently mitigated by the vaccine rollout. Britain's vaccination drive has now given at least a first dose to more than 29 million adults, and the government plans to complete the phase by the end of July. But it remains on guard against more infectious coronavirus variants, such as ones that emerged in Brazil and South Africa. Vaccines Minister Dadhim Zahawi told the Telegraph newspaper that the government could start delivering new booster doses in September for priority groups, including the over 70s and health workers. He said ministers were expecting up to 8 vaccines to be able by the autumn, up from 2 currently on offer in the UK, including one that could protect against 3 different COVID variants in a single jab. Britain, meanwhile, has been at loggerheads with Europe over supplies of jabs from the UK-based company AstraZeneca, which the EU said Friday must catch up on its deliveries to the bloc before exporting doses elsewhere. In phone talks with US President Joe Biden on Friday, Johnson stressed that global access to vaccines will be key to defeating the pandemic, according to a Downing Street spokesperson. Back to you in the studio.
Well, thank you for that report. Now, in celebration of Women's Month, Hawaii remembers its last monarch who upheld her lifelong conviction for peaceful, nonviolent protest, even when faced with defeat and humiliation. For more, we have 3 of our lady correspondents from Hawaii Pacific, Mio Cenas, Orion Torres, and Charmaine Sidera with that report.
Well, she remains one of the most important figures in our history. Kalani was a very tolerant monarch.
The measure of a leader can be determined by how they handle defeat, and no better was it shown than by the Kingdom of Hawaii's only ruling queen and last sovereign, Liliuokalani.
She presided over a very, very difficult time in Hawaiian history when her people, the indigenous peoples of Hawaii, the native Hawaiians, were at incredible risk of cultural and even physical extinction.
How she handled defeat is tied to the concept of kapu aloha, a Hawaiian term that preaches nonviolence in protests.
We can't go back on history, but we can go back and recognize the people that found the best solution that they could under the circumstances for their people, for their cultures, for their vision, And I think that that's what she did. You know, she was dealing with the realities of a very difficult situation.
Kapu Aloha. The phrase has been credited to her for the way she handled her removal from the throne and the subsequent annexation of the islands to the United States.
There was change in the world. That was a time of great activity by our country out there in the world. What was part of our country's coming of age, but had such devastating consequences to a lot of the world, especially to indigenous peoples, indigenous cultures, and that was true here.
January 17, 1893, American Henry E. Cooper, accompanied by the U.S. military, addressed a crowd assembled in front of the Royal Palace to proclaim the end of the Hawaiian monarchy and the formulation of a provisional civilian government.
They introduced the Marines and some of the sailors off the ship and surrounded the Iolani Palace. But because Leo Kalani did not want any bloodshed, the defenders of the Iolani Palace put on their arms. At that time she was in power, so she didn't want to see bloodshed, and she felt that she didn't want any upheaval in her kingdom.
Despite being afforded multiple opportunities to rise up against the Americans, Liliuokalani remained steadfast to her conviction for nonviolence.
We always going to disagree about something, but let us not go violent.
In 1895, Queen Liliuokalani agreed to formally abdicate her throne and was subsequently placed under house arrest at Iolani Palace. Liliuokalani continued to protest against annexation of the islands, which eventually occurred in July 1898. In that same year, she published her autobiography and composed the world-famous song Aloha Oi, translated as Farewell to Thee. In 1993, on the centennial anniversary of the kingdom's demise, President Bill Clinton signed a joint resolution of Congress formalizing the federal government's apology for actions taken against the people of Hawaii.
She maintained her commitment to her people, her dignity. She remains very, very relevant today, and she's entirely worthy of celebration in this Women's History Month, along with many other women of Hawaii.
Reporting from the Big Island of Hawaii, this is Charmaine Serrero.
Well, thank you for that, Eagle
technical
News.
glitch there. All right.
Well, Eagle News, so we'll be right back for more stories. Please don't go away.
For some entrepreneurs, their voice is their business. Voice-over talents, voice actors, voice artists, voice coaches, they belong to the creative service industry's thriving business accelerated by the global pandemic that requires work and collaboration to be done remotely. This week, we will hear the titan of Filipino voice acting and the highly sought-after voice director and trainer to share his views on the topic, Your Voice, Your Business.
Kung ano ang kaya mong ibigay ng libre, doon ka maaaring kumita ng malaki. Ano yon? Siyempre, skills mo, time mo, yung heart mo, yung puso mo sa ginagawa mo. Wala first of all, mabuhay ang sambay ng Pilipino. Alam nyo, sabi ko sa iyo, huwag nyo kong subukan. Diba, sabi ko, bawal ang droga, kundi patay ka diha.
Pocholo de Leon Gonzalez, known as the Voice Master of the Philippines, will be joining us in this episode of Open for Business.
Welcome back. Economic growth led by the U.S. and China is accelerating, amplifying the risks of an uneven global recovery, according to the head of the IMF today. Key factors in the improved outlook includes the U.S. passage of President Joe Biden's $1.9 trillion economic relief package and an expected bounce from coronavirus vaccines increasingly available in larger economies. Take a look.
In January, we projected global growth at 5.5% in 2021. We now expect a further acceleration, partly because of additional policy support, including the new fiscal package in the United States, partly because of the expected vaccine-powered recovery in many advanced economies later this year. This allows us for an upward revision to our global forecast for this year and for 2022. In fact, what we see is a multi-speed recovery increasingly powered by two engines, US and China. They're part of a small group of countries that will be well ahead of their pre-crisis GDP levels by the end of 2021. But they are the exception, not the rule. Accelerated recovery brings good news overall, but it may also create some less desired outcomes, the law of unintended consequences. For example, strong growth in the US can benefit many countries through increased trade. We expect inflation to remain contained, but faster US recovery could cause a rapid rise in interest rates, which could lead to a sharper tightening of financial conditions and significant capital outflows from emerging and developing economies. Progress in ending the health crisis could add almost $9 trillion to global GDP by 2025. But the window of opportunity is closing fast. The longer it takes to speed up vaccine production and rollout, the harder it will be to achieve these gains.
Finally, in our news, Washington residents flocked to the tidal basin to enjoy the city's famous cherry blossom trees in peak bloom. Watch this.
We're going back little by little to normal. This is incredible. It's like to have freedom again, and freedom is priceless. I know we went through a lot with this epidemic, but I think now we're seeing the light at the end of the tunnel.
For a day like this is great. It's nice to be out and see the life around you and get out of the house.
We live just a few blocks away, and we remember last year, the very last time we were here, and it's incredible to feel like we can finally come out and breathe again.
According to the Scientific American site, the National Park Service announced Sunday that the famous blossoms around the tidal basin had hit their peak bloom. Scientifically speaking, that's the point when at least 70% of all the blossoms have opened. The peak arrived several days earlier than NPS had originally forecast, likely spurred on by above average temperatures in the last week. It didn't just beat this year's forecast either. It's also nearly a week ahead of the average over the last 100 years, which typically falls around April 4. Still, the site said the early bloom is no big surprise. Cherry blossoms are highly sensitive to the weather, and as the climate has warmed, there's been a long-term trend towards earlier blooms.
Very beautiful. Wow. They had an early bloom in Japan too. Yeah.
Yes, and we did say yesterday we were going to go to Japan next year for that. Now we can go to Washington as well. We choose next year. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for thank you so much for joining us. That's it for tonight's broadcast. Please join us again tomorrow. I am CJ Hero.
And at the end of the day, there remains so much more to be grateful for. I'm Alma Angeles, and we live
in interesting
times.
Come over here. Come on.